After years of music experts wondering will they or won't they, Pink Floyd has finally sold their music catalogue for around $400 million. The Financial Times reported late last week the British rock band had brokered a deal with Sony to let go of over 5 decades worth of music. Joining me now to walk us through the significance of this deal is former music journalist Dave Mason. Dave, thanks for your time today. $400 million this deal is for the surviving members of Pink Floyd. Walk me through the agreement that they made with Sony.
It's an agreement which means that they'll be selling imaging rights but not publishing rights, and also mechanical performance rights. So those who performed on the records over the years means that everybody in the band can get something rather than just the writers. So this is slightly different to the agreements that were reached with Bob Dylan, Bruce Springsteen and Sting, who sold publishing rights a couple of years ago, meaning that they got an advance, if you like, in perpetuity for the rights to the material that they'd recorded and written over many years. So this isn't for publishing and the rights to the written work of Pink Floyd. This is for use in commercials, theatrical, the naming rights for the name Pink Floyd, and for the imaging rights as well, which means even the artwork for the front covers of their albums going back over many years to the early 1970s are all included in this deal. So it's much more about the imaging and, of course, the performance and mechanical rights for those members of the band that performed on the records. Because, of course, not every single member has a writing credit in each case for every single song. So if it was for publishing, those other members of the band would lose out. But when it's something like this, where it's more about the band and imaging and naming rights, then they can all get a slice, including, of course, the estate for the late Rick Wright, who was the keyboard player who died in 2008. It's a bit like when Queen more recently sold their rights, and Freddie Mercury had famously said to his manager in the late 80s, early 90s, before he died, "I don't care what you do with me as long as you don't make me dull." Words to that effect. And of course, Queen have gone on to use their image, and their rights now are used in commercials, adverts, film, and of course, theatre.
It's an interesting deal that they brokered with Sony because in most cases you hear bands selling off their songwriting rights, their publishing rights, but Pink Floyd's $400 million deal doesn't include that. Is there a reason why they wouldn't have included the rights to the songwriting in this deal?
Well, they can hold out on that, and it means that the writers, chiefly people like David Gilmour and Roger Waters, could sell the actual publishing and songwriting amount for a similar amount again. Because that has an entirely different value, because it's the rights to the actual songwriting itself. And that's a different kind of deal. But, we've seen the likes of Sting and Christine McVie before she died in recent years sell their publishing and songwriting back catalogue. And in these legacies, whichever way it goes down in the deal, what they're doing is creating a legacy both for their families after they are no longer here, especially in the case of Christine McVie, who sadly died in 2022. So it secures that legacy going into the future for their families. But interestingly, in the case of Pink Floyd, Dave Gilmour has apparently been quoted as saying that this is one way of preventing the arguments and the ongoing, as he described it, mudbath and warring that's gone on as regards the legacy of Pink Floyd between him and former bass player Roger Waters, who left in 1985. And there, of course, have been notorious war of words between those two in the media pretty much ever since. They have, of course, reunited a few times since that. But what happens for artists is if your management receives a request to use your song in a film and you've got factions and disagreement, then imagine having to sign off every single usage of that band's material or likeness, or whether it's used in a theatre or a movie, every single time that request comes in. By doing this, it means that Pink Floyd and its imaging and naming rights and so on can be used without the arguments and the warring. And I think that's what David Gilmour was trying to avoid here by doing this deal. But of course, in the background of all of this, of course, is the fact that in the 1980s, Roger Waters did unsuccessfully try to sue the remaining members of the band, notably Nick Mason and David Gilmour, because he wanted to prevent them using the name Pink Floyd. He was unsuccessful in that attempt, and he carried on going out and touring with his version of The Wall. And of course, future albums were made by David Gilmour and Nick Mason and Rick Wright. So in a way, this is Gilmour's attempt, I think, to just secure that legacy without any of the hassle now that he's getting into his twilight years.
Pink Floyd's inner band fighting killed another deal that they reportedly had in the pipeline for an even more expensive price. Is this a known ongoing problem where their fighting has stymied previous deals?
You could say that, and there's plenty of other artists whose own fighting and famous squabbles have prevented perhaps more lucrative deals. It would have happened with Apple and the Beatles in 1970, probably one of the most famous corporate struggles, when the Beatles split up as well. So, this does go on. But I think what's interesting about this is that it does include the iconic artwork, which adorned albums such as Dark Side of the Moon, Wish You Were Here, and Animals, which is said to be part of it. And of course, David Gilmour, more recently, because of this, now bringing it back into Rolling Stone magazine and the public domain and lots of media attention, it's meant that David Gilmour has had to reaffirm that he has ruled out that he'll reunite with Roger Waters. They're not aligned on the creative ideas they had in Pink Floyd. That was famous, but clearly some of the comments made publicly in the media about Ukraine and Israel by Roger Waters has meant that David Gilmour has wanted to further distance himself in any way from Roger Waters. And Roger Waters has come out and issued video statements even in recent weeks saying David Gilmour thinks he owns Pink Floyd, he thinks he is it. And David Gilmour's replied by saying, this isn't a two-way row. Roger Waters, it's always been a sort of one-way bitterness from David Gilmour's perspective, and I think he just wants to draw a line under it and put an end to this kind of feuding by signing this over to another organisation and letting them make the decisions about how the name and everything else is used to a third party. And you can see why that would make sense for artists at this point in their lives who don't really need to do it for the money, but just want to create a legacy and perhaps certain parameters around how it is used going into the future, for your own family members, and to actually create a legacy which is untarnished.
The Sony deal has been described as one of the larger deals in the last few years. What other deals have been made as massive as the Pink Floyd one?
Well, the recent ones, of course, with Bruce Springsteen and Sting have reportedly been in the hundreds of millions, and that's for a single artist. Whether or not artists like Peter Gabriel, for example, or U2, there's talk of Noel Gallagher even lining up to potentially sell their songwriting, because if you're an artist who's having a high point or some kind of resurgence, as with the likes of Oasis at the moment, then it adds a great deal of higher stock to the value of your back catalogue. So there's a premium time. I'm sure lots of business managers for many of these artists will be saying, your stock is high at the moment, maybe you should consider selling your publishing or imaging rights at a high point. It's not something you want to come down from the crest of a wave and then be trying to sell them when you're at a low point. So for me, I could see Noel Gallagher, who of course is the prime writer, main writer in Oasis, U2, Rolling Stones. As I say, Christine McVie did this before she died as one of the members of Fleetwood Mac that sold her legacy and her publishing out. I would think the remaining members of Fleetwood Mac now might be similarly considering doing the same thing. So that would include Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks, of course.
Dave, what's in it for Sony or other big corporations or private equity firms when acquiring these big expensive purchases off musicians? What do they get out of it?
Well, to take you back and explain a story, when Paul McCartney accidentally let slip in the studio to Michael Jackson that he was thinking of buying the Beatles' back catalogue from Northern Songs, Michael Jackson got wind of this and sort of beat Paul McCartney at auction, famously and controversially, buying the Beatles' back catalogue. And McCartney was understandably angry and upset about it at the time. Michael Jackson sat on that back catalogue of the Beatles for a number of years and reportedly doubled his money when he sold it to Sony Music again many years later. So obviously it creates value on the balance sheet for those organisations, but it also means that they can, in perpetuity, keep maintaining returning royalties and returning revenues from huge legacy artists into the future from such things as commercials, TV, theatrical performances, musicals, etc., again and again. And of course, online and through many different platforms, there are lots of ways of now making this money. And record companies, as they have found it difficult to diversify their income, you haven't got the new artists coming through making so much money from recorded music. These record companies, of course, can continue to make huge sums from very large, from artists who have been big and have produced and sold many records over the last 50 years. So it's returning income. But what you get, of course, with that are artists at the top of the tree, and Dave Gilmour has alluded to this, making huge amounts of money at the top end of it. And of course, at the lower end, smaller artists still struggling to make anything from recorded music. And what this sets up is an existential problem in the recording and music industry. People making hardly any money at the bottom end, with new artists struggling to come through and make a return, because the only way they can make money these days is by constantly touring and gigging. And then, of course, a thinner end of the wedge at the far end of that, the other extreme, are all these artists who've been around for 40, 50 years, making in some cases hundreds of millions of dollars. Virgin Radio.